Wyoming Territory, winter of 1867. The land stretched endless and unforgiving, wrapped in thick, blinding snow. Cold wasn't just a feeling here, it was something that got inside a person, worked its way into their bones, slowed them down until they simply stopped. Margaret Turner knew this. She knew it in the ache of her limbs, in the way her breath came shallow and thin, barely misting in the freezing air. She knew it in the weight of her daughter, Lily, who had grown too quiet in her arms, too still. That was the part that terrified her the most. The little girl had cried at first, her tiny sobs breaking against the wind. But now there was nothing but silence. Margaret adjusted her grip, pulling Lily closer against her chest, whispering, "We're almost there, sweetheart." But even she didn't know if that was true. The world around them had become nothing but white, the sky and the ground blending into one. There was no road, no sign of life, only the relentless push of the wind and the sting of snow cutting against her face. She had been walking for hours, maybe longer. Her legs burned, but she kept moving, because stopping meant the end. She thought of her husband, of the home she had lost. It had been warm once, safe. But after his death, the world had turned colder than any winter. His family had seen to that. And just like that, the memory came flooding back. The fire had burned low in the cabin that night, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. The air had smelled of damp wool and unspoken words. Margaret had sat near the hearth, one arm wrapped around Lily's small shoulders, the other clenched into a fist at her side. Across the room, her husband's brother, Thomas, had stood with his arms crossed, his expression hard, unreadable. "You can't stay here," he had said. The words had landed like a blow. Margaret had felt them in her chest, sharp and cruel. She had swallowed against the tightness in her throat, shaking her head. "We have nowhere else to go." Thomas hadn't looked at her. He had glanced at his wife instead, and she had refused to meet Margaret's eyes. "We can barely feed ourselves," Thomas had muttered. "You think we can take care of you too? A widow with a child?" Margaret's breath had come faster. Her heart had pounded against her ribs. "I don't need much, just a roof over Lily's head. I'll work. I'll do whatever you ask." Thomas had exhaled through his nose, the sound like a heavy door closing. "I'm sorry," he had said, though there had been no real apology in it. "But we're not your family, Margaret. Not anymore." Lily had pressed herself closer to Margaret's side, her small fingers clutching the fabric of her mother's dress. "Please," Margaret had whispered. "She's just a child." The silence had stretched too long. Then, finally, Thomas had turned away. The meaning had been clear. There was no place for them here. Margaret had risen slowly, her limbs stiff with cold and shock. Her breath had felt too thin, the walls of the cabin pressing in. She had bent down, gathered Lily in her arms, and walked to the door. No one had stopped her. And when she had stepped out into the night, the door had closed behind her without a word. The sound of the bolt sliding into place had been the loudest thing in the world. Margaret blinked hard, pushing the memory away. The wind howled around her, biting at her exposed skin. That door had closed, but she was still walking, still moving forward. She had no choice. Then, just ahead, through the blur of the storm, she saw something dark against the endless white. Her heart stuttered. A building, small, distant but real. Shelter, safety, hope. She pushed forward, but before she could take another step, a sound cut through the howling wind. A low growl. Margaret stopped. She turned her head slowly, her breath coming faster now. The wolf stood just a few yards away, its body thin and hungry, its eyes locked onto her. Predators knew weakness, and Margaret was weak. It knew she was moving slower than she should be, knew she was carrying more than she could bear. She had no doubt it had been following her, waiting for this moment. Lily stirred slightly in her arms, and Margaret tightened her grip. Her mind raced. She had a knife. But what good would it do against an animal like this? The wolf took a step forward, then another. It was closing in. Margaret braced herself, shifting Lily behind her as best as she could. If it lunged, she would fight. She would lose, but she would fight. The wolf tensed, muscles coiling beneath its thin frame. A gunshot rang out. The crack of it echoed through the valley, shattering the quiet. The wolf collapsed mid-lunge, its body hitting the snow just feet from where Margaret stood. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of her own breathing, harsh and uneven. Then she saw him. A man stood a short distance away, a rifle in his hands, the barrel still trailing smoke. His coat was heavy, dusted with snow, his face partially shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her. Margaret held Lily tighter, her heart pounding. The man finally lowered his rifle. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady. "You need help." Margaret didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could trust him, but she was out of choices. She looked down at Lily, at the child's pale lips, and the way her tiny fingers curled weakly into her shawl. Margaret swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, help her." The man nodded once, then took a step closer. And for the first time in days, Margaret let someone else carry the weight. Margaret had not spoken since they arrived. She had followed him in silence, watching as he placed Lily on the cot, covered her with blankets, and stirred the fire higher. He moved with quiet efficiency, neither hurried nor hesitant. Margaret stood near the door, her breath still uneven from the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She should feel relief, but instead she felt exposed. James, he had said his name was James, removed his rifle from his shoulder and leaned it against the wall. "She'll be warmer soon," he said, not looking at Margaret. "She needs food, but small amounts. If she eats too fast, it'll make her sick." Margaret only nodded. James stepped away from the cot and reached for a pot hanging near the hearth. The scent of broth, faint but warm, drifted into the air as he poured some into a wooden bowl. He carried it to the table and set it down. "It ain't much," he said, his voice even, "but it'll help." Margaret hesitated. She should refuse. He had already done enough. But pride didn't keep a child alive. She crossed the small room and lowered herself onto the bench. Her fingers curled around the bowl, the heat seeping into her skin. When she lifted the spoon to her lips, the warmth of it startled her. She swallowed carefully, feeling it settle deep inside her, spreading like something unfamiliar. James sat across the room, near the fire, his gaze flicking toward her but never lingering. He was giving her space, she realized. The silence stretched between them, not tense, but not yet comfortable either. Margaret glanced at Lily. The child's breathing had evened out, her small body sinking deeper into the blankets. The color had not yet returned to her face, but she no longer looked like she was slipping away. Margaret swallowed hard, lowering the spoon. "Thank you." The words came out quietly, but they were the first she had spoken since he shot the wolf. James gave a small nod. "You're welcome." She studied him for a moment, unsure what to make of him. He didn't ask her questions, didn't pry. That alone made her uneasy. People always wanted to know things. Where you came from, where you were going. But James didn't seem to care. Still, there was something about him that felt steady. Margaret set the bowl down, rubbing her hands together for warmth. She had been so cold for so long, she wasn't sure if she would ever feel normal again. James stirred the fire. "There's an extra blanket on the shelf," he said. "If you need it." Margaret hesitated, then stood. She reached for the heavy wool and draped it around her shoulders, the weight of it solid, reassuring. She sat back down, glancing toward him. "You live here alone?" James nodded. "For a while now." Margaret tightened the blanket around herself. "You don't ask questions." James shrugged slightly. "Figured you'd tell me what you wanted to." She hadn't expected that. People were not usually so patient with silence. Margaret looked at Lily again, her daughter's small hand curled loosely over the blanket. "We had nowhere else to go," she admitted. The words felt heavy, but less so now that they had been spoken. James nodded as if he understood. Maybe he did. Margaret exhaled slowly. The fire crackled. The storm outside had quieted, but the world was still buried in snow. There was no leaving, not yet. She looked back at James, watching the way the firelight flickered across his face. She had spent the last 2 days walking through a world that felt like it had swallowed her whole. But here, in this small cabin, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not safety, not yet, but something close. Margaret woke to warmth. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The feeling was too foreign, too distant from the past few days of endless cold and exhaustion. The fire still burned low in the hearth, filling the cabin with a steady heat. The scent of something cooking lingered in the air, faint, but real. Then she remembered. The storm. The wolf. James. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Lily was still curled beneath the blankets beside her, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Some of the color had returned to her face. Margaret exhaled, relief settling deep in her bones. Across the room, James stood near the stove, flipping something in a cast-iron pan. His movements were easy, practiced. Margaret blinked, surprised. She had not expected a man like him to cook. James glanced over his shoulder. "There's coffee," he said simply. "If you want it." Margaret hesitated before rising. Her body ached, but it was the kind of ache that came from rest after exhaustion. She crossed the room and poured herself a small cup, wrapping her fingers around it. It was hot and bitter, but the warmth of it spread through her, grounding her. James set a plate on the table, cornbread still steaming. Margaret stared at it. It wasn't much, but after days of hunger, it felt like a feast. She pulled out a chair and sat down. "You didn't have to do all this," James shrugged. "Figured you'd be hungry." She didn't argue. She simply picked up a piece of cornbread, breaking off a bite. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was easy. Then, a small sound broke through it, a rustling beneath the blankets. Lily stirred, shifting slightly, blinking up at her mother with bleary eyes. Margaret set down her cup and leaned forward, brushing hair from her daughter's forehead. "Morning, sweetheart." Lily blinked again, then slowly looked around the room. Her little fingers clutched at the fabric of the blanket as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then her eyes landed on James. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him warily. James, to his credit, didn't say anything. He simply turned back to the stove as if he hadn't noticed. But Margaret saw the way he adjusted his movements, slower, less abrupt, as if giving Lily time to grow used to his presence. Lily turned back to her mother, her voice a whisper. "Where are we?" Margaret smoothed a hand down her daughter's arm. "A man helped us," she said. "We're safe here." Lily hesitated before whispering, "Who is he?" James didn't look over, but Margaret saw the faintest hint of a smirk at the corner of his mouth. He had heard. She glanced at him before answering. "His name is James." Lily didn't reply. She only curled in closer against her mother's side, her small fingers still gripping the blanket. Margaret understood. Her daughter had always been quiet, cautious. And after what they had been through, trust wouldn't come easily. James set another plate on the table, this time with a smaller portion. He didn't say anything, just placed it there before returning to his seat near the fire. Lily peeked at the food, then at him. Her stomach must have won the battle against her fear, because after a moment, she sat up slightly, pulling the plate onto her lap. Margaret watched as her daughter picked at the cornbread, taking careful bites. James didn't acknowledge it. He simply reached for a knife and a block of wood, settling into his chair as if nothing had changed. But Margaret knew better. Trust was built in small steps, and Lily had just taken the first one. Later that day, the cabin had grown warmer, the fire keeping the worst of the cold at bay. James sat in his usual chair, whittling away at a small block of wood. His hands were steady, precise, as he carved away the rough edges. Margaret was mending a tear in Lily's dress when she noticed her daughter watching him. Lily sat curled up in the cot, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her small fingers gripping the edge of the fabric. She wasn't afraid anymore, just curious. Margaret didn't say anything. She let it be. James, for his part, acted as if he hadn't noticed. He kept working, the soft scrape of the knife against wood the only sound in the room. After a while, he glanced up. "You ever seen a sparrow up close?" Lily blinked, caught off guard by the question. She hesitated before shaking her head. James nodded toward the small carving in his hands. "They don't leave in winter," he said. "Most birds do, but sparrows stay." Lily didn't say anything, but Margaret saw her shift slightly, her attention fully on him now. James held up the wooden carving. It was a small bird, wings closely folded against its body. He turned it over in his hands, studying his work. Then, without a word, he set it on the edge of the table and went back to carving. Lily's eyes lingered on it. Margaret watched as her daughter hesitated, then slowly, carefully, slid off the cot. Her bare feet barely made a sound against the wooden floor as she took a tentative step forward. She stopped near the table, glancing at James. He didn't look up. Lily swallowed, then reached out, her small fingers closing around the wooden bird. She held it close, studying the details, the careful lines of the feathers, the curve of the wings. Then, after a long moment, she hugged it to her chest. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. James only nodded once, satisfied. No words had been spoken. None were needed. The days passed in quiet routine. The storm had long since settled, but the world outside was still buried beneath thick snow. There was no leaving yet, not with the roads impassable. And so Margaret and Lily remained in the cabin, their days marked by the simple tasks of survival, tending the fire, gathering wood, cooking what little they had. It should have felt like waiting, but it didn't. Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm of this place in ways she hadn't expected. Lily did too. She no longer flinched when James entered the room, no longer clung to Margaret's skirts like she might disappear. She still didn't speak much to him, but she listened. She watched. And then one evening, without prompting, she sat beside him by the fire and placed the wooden bird in his lap. James glanced at it, then at her. He said nothing, only nodded, then picked up his knife and began carving something new. Margaret had watched the exchange from across the room, something tight pulling at her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected any of this. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn. She had grown used to the sounds of the cabin, the steady breathing of Lily beside her, the wind pressing against the walls, the occasional shifting of James in his chair by the fire. But this morning, the cabin was quiet, too quiet. James was gone. Margaret sat up, her heartbeat quickening for reasons she didn't fully understand. Then she saw the door, slightly ajar. She wrapped a shawl around herself and stepped outside. The cold was sharp, but not unbearable. Snow stretched untouched across the land, save for the footprints leading toward the trees. She followed them, instinct pulling her forward. She found him a short distance away, standing by the woodpile, splitting logs. His breath misted in the air, his movements smooth, practiced. Margaret hesitated, watching him. The morning light was soft, filtering through the trees, catching on the sharp lines of his face. He looked different like this, less guarded, almost peaceful. She wasn't sure how long she stood there before he noticed her. When he did, he straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "You're up early." Margaret swallowed, shifting her weight. "So are you." James nodded toward the pile of wood. "Figured we'd need more before the next storm." Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him. She had spent so much time fearing him, fearing the unknown. But here he was, a man who had saved her child, who had given them warmth and food, who had asked for nothing in return. A man who, even now, would not look away first. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She should move. She should say something, step back, break whatever this was. But she didn't. She only exhaled, her breath curling in the cold morning air, and held his gaze a moment longer than she should have. Later that day, the cold set in deeper. Margaret sat near the hearth, mending Lily's dress. The fire crackled, filling the cabin with a quiet warmth. James sat across from her, sharpening his knife. The rhythm of it had become familiar. Lily sat on the floor, humming softly, her wooden bird clutched in her hands. She no longer hesitated in James's presence. In fact, she barely seemed to notice the distance that had once been there at all. Margaret stole a glance at James. He was focused on his task, his brow slightly furrowed, the firelight catching against the sharp edges of his face. He had kind hands, she realized, rough, worn, but careful. She lowered her gaze quickly, pressing her lips together. This was dangerous. Not him. Not the way he moved through the world, steady and quiet. The way he spoke without demand. The way he had given her and Lily a place to breathe. No. The dangerous part was how she felt when she looked at him. She tugged the thread in her hand too hard, and it snapped. She let out a soft sigh, reaching for another, but before she could, James was there. He had crossed the room without her noticing, crouching beside her. His hand covered hers, just for a moment, as he picked up the broken thread. Margaret froze. The warmth of his fingers sent something sharp and unexpected through her. James didn't move. He held the thread between them, his hand still brushing against hers, his breath steady, measured. Margaret should pull away. She didn't. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like running. The morning air was crisp, carrying the last traces of winter. Margaret stood outside the cabin, arms wrapped around herself, watching as James stacked the last of the firewood near the porch. She had spent weeks waiting for him to ask, "When are you leaving?" But he never did. And the longer he didn't ask, the more she realized something she hadn't let herself admit. She wasn't sure if she wanted to. James caught her staring, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, he exhaled. "You're thinking about something." Margaret glanced down at the snow beneath her boots. "I'm always thinking about something." James gave a small smirk, but didn't push. He nodded toward the horizon. "Won't be long before the snow melts." Margaret knew what he meant. The roads would clear soon. The world would keep moving. She swallowed hard. James hesitated, as if weighing something. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I had a wife and son once." Margaret stilled. James didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the tree line, the way the morning sun touched the frost-covered branches. His voice was quiet even, like he had told himself this story so many times that the words had lost their meaning. Annie, Caleb, they were everything. Margaret felt her breath catch. James inhaled slowly. We had a place, about a day's ride south of here. Just land and a small cabin, but it was ours. I was in town when it happened. He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Raiders hit the homestead while I was gone, took what they wanted, burned the rest. Margaret's stomach twisted. She couldn't finish the question. James didn't make her. When I got back, the house was still smoking. His voice was steady, but his hands clenched at his sides. I found them inside. Margaret's chest ached. She knew this kind of pain, the kind that never really left. James shook his head. I should have been there. Should have. He trailed off, exhaling sharply. By the time I got back, there was nothing left to do but bury them. Margaret swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I'm sorry. James nodded, but didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he turned to her. That's why I live out here. Ain't much left anywhere else. Margaret stared at him, something breaking open in her chest. She had been cast out into the cold. He had come home to it. And now somehow they had both ended up here. James studied her carefully. Then, with a quiet certainty, he spoke the words she hadn't been ready to hear before. You don't have to go. Margaret closed her eyes. Because there it was. The thing she had been waiting for. The thing she had been running from. And the worst part? She didn't want to run anymore. That night, the wind picked up again. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the fire crackle. Lily slept soundly beside her, her tiny breaths warm against Margaret's arm. But Margaret couldn't sleep. Not with the weight of everything pressing down on her. With a quiet sigh, she slid out of bed, careful not to wake her daughter. The cabin was dim, the fire casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. James was still awake. He sat in his usual chair near the hearth, a book resting on his knee, though he didn't seem to be reading it. He glanced up when Margaret approached, his expression unreadable. She hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she sat in the chair across from him. Neither of them spoke. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the fire, the faint whistle of wind against the cabin walls. Then, finally, James closed the book. I've been meaning to ask you something, he said quietly. Margaret tensed, though she didn't know why. What? James hesitated, then met her gaze. You ever think about what comes next? Margaret's fingers tightened around the blanket draped over her shoulders. She had been waiting for him to ask. And yet now that the moment was here, she had no idea how to answer. James leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding. He was just waiting. Waiting for her to say the thing she had been too afraid to admit to herself. Margaret swallowed hard. I don't know, she whispered. James nodded as if that was answer enough. And maybe it was, because for the first time in weeks, he didn't tell her what she should do. He didn't offer solutions, didn't remind her that the roads would soon be clear. He just sat there, watching her, letting her sit in the silence of her own uncertainty. And that somehow was worse, because it meant the decision had always been hers. And maybe, just maybe, that terrified her most of all. Margaret didn't know why she did it. Maybe it was the firelight, the way it softened the sharp edges of the cabin, the way it made everything feel safer than it really was. Or maybe it was the exhaustion, the weeks of running, of never having a place to belong, of always waiting for the next door to shut in her face. Whatever it was, she spoke before she could stop herself. I was afraid, she admitted. That night, when they turned me out. James didn't move, but something in his expression shifted. Margaret exhaled sharply, shaking her head. I thought maybe I deserved it. That maybe I had done something wrong. That if I had just been a little stronger, a little smarter, they would have let me stay. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. But I could have begged on my hands and knees and it wouldn't have mattered. James was quiet for a long time. Then slowly, he leaned back in his chair, his voice steady, calm. You didn't deserve that. Margaret inhaled sharply. The words landed deeper than she expected, wrapping around something raw inside her. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something. James wasn't offering comfort. He wasn't saying it because he thought she needed to hear it. He was saying it because it was true, and that was what undid her. Her throat tightened. She looked away, but not before James saw. After a long moment, he spoke again, softer this time. You don't have to go. Margaret inhaled sharply, feeling the truth of James's words sink into her bones. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she deserved more. That maybe she didn't have to run anymore. James didn't speak again, but his quiet presence filled the room, offering silent reassurance. Margaret let the warmth of that moment linger, realizing suddenly that in this small cabin, she'd found something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. The morning came slow and quiet. Margaret woke to the soft glow of early light slipping through the cabin's small window. The fire had burned down to embers, filling the space with a steady warmth. Lily was still asleep, curled beneath the heavy blankets, one small hand resting against the wooden bird James had carved for her. Margaret sat up carefully, watching her daughter's peaceful face. She had spent so many nights afraid of what was next, of where they would go, of whether Lily would make it through another storm. But now, as she listened to the steady rhythm of her child's breathing, something else settled in her chest. Not fear. Something quieter. Something like peace. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and stood. The cabin was still, but she wasn't alone. James was outside. She could see him through the window, stacking the last of the firewood. Margaret hesitated. She had spent weeks preparing for the moment she would leave. But now, standing there watching him, she realized she wasn't preparing anymore. She was deciding. James didn't look up right away when she stepped outside. The cold nipped at her skin, but she barely felt it, not with the weight of what she was about to say, pressing heavy in her chest. He placed another log onto the pile, brushing snow from his gloves. Then finally he turned. Margaret met his gaze. For the first time, she didn't look away. James studied her, quiet, waiting. Margaret swallowed. She wasn't good at this, saying things that mattered, speaking feelings aloud when they had spent so long buried deep inside her. But she forced herself to try. I don't want to go. James didn't react at first, didn't speak. Then slowly, he exhaled. The tension in his shoulders eased, just slightly. Margaret pressed on, her voice softer now. I don't know what staying looks like. I don't know if I'll ever get it right. But I'm tired of running. And Lily, she needs a place, a real place, not just another stop along the way. She swallowed hard. And maybe I do too. James was still watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he stepped forward, close enough that she could see the way the morning light softened his face, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even in the cold. His voice was steady. Then stay. Margaret exhaled sharply, something in her chest unraveling. It was simple, so simple. No grand speeches, no declarations, just an offering. And for the first time in a long time, she took it. That evening, the cabin felt different. Not physically. The walls were the same, The fire still burned in the hearth. The shadows still flickered in the same places. But Margaret felt the shift in her bones. She sat at the table, watching Lily, who was curled up beside James, her small fingers resting against his sleeve as she drifted in and out of sleep. James didn't move, didn't shift away or make space. He simply sat there, letting the weight of a sleeping child settle against him. Margaret's throat tightened. She had spent years waiting for doors to close, for people to tell her she wasn't wanted, that there was no place for her. But tonight in this small cabin, with the fire burning and the snow settled thick outside, she didn't feel like she was waiting anymore. She felt like she had arrived. She reached for her cup of coffee, but before she could take a sip, James spoke, his voice quiet but sure. "You ever seen a sparrow up close?" Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the question. James nodded toward the wooden carving Lily still clutched in her hand. "They don't leave in winter," he said. "Most birds do. But sparrows stay." Margaret swallowed, looking down at her own hands. Then carefully she reached across the table, resting her fingers lightly over his. Not tightly, not desperately, just enough. James stilled for a moment, then slowly turned his hand beneath hers, curling his fingers around her own. No more waiting, no more running. She was staying, and that was enough.